Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 12 of the course. I hope everybody's doing well. We're getting close, right? We're coming down the home stretch of the semester, so about 1 month left to go. Okay, so this week we've started, or I guess last week we started to make the transition from the presidency, current day, to going back to the founding and looking at the Constitution. Right. So I had you guys look at John Roche's article on the Constitutional Convention and the founding of the Constitution, called a reform caucus in action, right? And the main reason that I wanted you guys to read this article, I mean, besides getting great, information on how the convention actually unfolded, was to sort of dispel the myths that we have about the founding fathers, right? Because we all almost worship them in a way. They're these, and they were brilliant guys, and they had, this incredible wisdom and this incredible vision that guided their hand in drafting the Constitution. But when you actually go back and look at how it actually unfolded, you find that I think he called it a patchwork, right? It was something that was thrown together in a lot of ways, and it was the product of political expediency, rather than this sort of divine wisdom that put everything together perfectly, right? It didn't work out that way. And, that's what the thing that Roche was trying to say was, yeah, and these guys weren't, they didn't know everything. They were political geniuses, but, they didn't have the wisdom to lay everything out perfectly. But he did say the thing that he wanted you to take away from the paper is that they were expert Democratic politicians, right? They all had their own agendas coming from their different states, their own personal agendas based on being wealthy landowners. So they wanted to maintain their own personal interests, but they also wanted to make the country a better place, right? So the country had been governed since the end of the Revolution, for around 11 years under the Articles of Confederation, right? And the Articles of Confederation just were not doing a good job of keeping the country together, right? Because the Articles of Confederation, were supposed to moderate disputes between the states. They were supposed to provide for national security. There was a Confederation Congress, right? But the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that it didn't give the national government the authority to tax. Right, so it's essentially kind of like the UN today, right? It has all these goals set out, like mediating disputes between individual states or countries in the case of the UN, and protection of the national government. But without the means to do that and to raise the money, they were essentially left in the position of begging for money in the states, right? And it was a toothless tiger. So, and there were all sorts of major disputes that were popping up between the individual colonies. So, those members who were part of that Congress, the Confederation Congress, knew that some action had to be taken, right? And that's why they called for this meeting to discuss, okay, how do we need to change the Articles of Confederation to make it better, right? And Roche called this the old political trap, right? Rather than saying you're going to get together and write a new constitution, you just say, well, we want to get together to discuss this, right? Because you can't, obviously if they had said, well, we want to get together and write a new constitution where the national government is going to be much stronger than the states' governments, then the opposition would have known what they were up to, and they never would have gotten together, and the Constitution never would have gotten drafted or written. In many ways, what happened in 1787 was the Second American Revolution, because you have to remember that there was a sovereign American government in place under the Articles of Confederation. And essentially what happened in the Constitutional Convention is that they overthrew the sovereign government of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. So it was I guess you could say, a bloodless revolution, right? So let's see. I asked you guys about some of the challenges, right? Obviously, one of the things that Roche talked about was the challenges of actually getting the delegates there, specifically New York, because without New York, it couldn't happen, right? What were some of the assets that they brought to it, right? Well, first and foremost, they had George Washington on their side. And Washington was the president. He ended up being the president of the Constitutional Convention, right? So amazing political talent, right? So I mean, especially James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, right? And often Madison is considered to sort of be the architect of the Constitution. And you read this article, look into the history, you see that Madison is the one who showed up first. He was the first person there, and he had a plan, right? He had the plan coming in, which was what's called the Virginia Plan. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. Which essentially laid the framework for what our government actually looks like now, right? Madison suggested a two house legislature, right, bicameral Congress, where it would all be based on the representation, which turned out to be the big sticking point for the Virginia Plan, is the representation was all based on population, right? So the bigger states had the biggest had the biggest representation, right? And the first house would be elected by the states, and then the second house, which would be the current Senate, would actually be elected by the House of Representatives, right? So they were actually appointed, which is in fact exactly what happened in our government up until the beginning of the 20th century, right? In the early 1900s is when senators actually became popularly elected, right? So the only difference, or one of the major differences with Madison's plan, was this notion of representation, and that changed, right, with the New Jersey plan. So the way it worked under the Articles of Confederation in their Congress was, in the Confederation Congress, was that each state got one vote. Right, and that's essentially what the New Jersey plan proposed, is that rather than there being seats apportioned based on population and the size of the states, that each state would essentially get one vote. Right, so obviously the larger states like Virginia and Massachusetts were not happy with that way of apportioning delegates, and that's how we ended up with this thing called the Connecticut Compromise, right? Which is where you have one house, the Senate, which is based on equal representation for all the states, and then you have the House of Representatives, which is based on population, right? So you can see how you've got, you got the large states who want one thing, of course, and the smaller states who want something else, and then they were able to get together and actually bring about that compromise. And then Roche also talked a little bit about this idea of federalism, right? And federalism as the driving principle of American political theory, right? And federalism is that government is done at the appropriate level, right? So there is a strong national government who controls national matters, interstate commerce, things like that, national defense. There are state governments that handle things primarily at the state level, things that have to do with the states or the commonwealths. And then there are municipal governments, right? So, ideally the problem would be handled at the level, whether it's municipal, state, or national, that the matter required, right? So that's the notion of federalism. But Roche kind of goes in to try to dispel this myth that, Madison was some great federalist, right? Because in fact, Madison was a very strong nationalist. He wanted there to be a very strong central government that had the authority to essentially completely override the states, right? So even anything passed by the states, Madison thought that, the national legislature should be able to strike it down at any time. So this notion of Madison as a federalist is a bit of a stretch, at least during the sort of the Constitutional Convention piece, until a few months or years later, when Madison started writing the Federalist Papers, and that's when he started to adopt more of the sort of the philosophy of federalism and government at the appropriate level. So let's see what else. Yeah, he talked about the Electoral College too, right? Which was interesting as we've been thinking about sort of the insanity of the Electoral College. And it was just an expedient measure, right? It wasn't this greatly crafted piece of political wisdom that was supposed to govern the way or presidential elections were to happen um, throughout. But it was just a way of essentially making sure that each side felt like they were being fairly treated, right? So it was once again politically expedient, and he said, he said that he thinks the founders would probably be a little bit concerned if they came back and saw that the Electoral College was actually still in place. And George Mason, Virginia representative, said that 19 out of 20 times the presidential election is going to be decided in the House of Representatives. Right, but this is way before like the because at that point, remember, there were no political parties, so the notion that you could get some sort of consensus behind one candidate without there being the mechanisms of the political parties seemed very unlikely at that point. But now that's why we have these two party systems, and where they're going through this very elaborate, drawn out process now of choosing a nominee, so that in fact the Electoral College works much more efficiently now than it did when the Constitution was written. So kind of interesting. Um, yeah, and then of course slavery was another major issue, right? And obviously it was the issue of the day, and it speaks directly to this issue of representation, right? Because the idea, of course, the idea at the time was that if the states that had slaves were able to count slaves as individuals, then their representation would be a lot greater in the legislature, right? So eventually, what they settled on was the 3/5 compromise, right? So every slave that was held counted as 3/5 of an individual in regard to representation in the legislature. So just these constant back and forth compromises, right? And it would be, a lot of people were saying in the discussions, the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? Because we see that the exact same issues that the challenges that they were dealing with back then are the same challenges we seem to be dealing with today. But the thing that it seemed like, there was much more willingness to perhaps compromise back then, because they got this entire Constitution written in about 3 months, right? And it seems like in Congress today we can't even get a simple piece of legislation passed. So I'd like to believe that we still have the democratic capacities to come together and pass important pieces of legislation, but it seems to be getting increasingly more difficult as the ideologies become much more entrenched today, right? But the main thing Roche wanted to say was, look, these guys were extremely skilled Democratic politicians, and this is what it takes to get something like this passed. And he said, don't take the Constitution and translate it into these other languages of these countries that are already established and already have very well-functioning governments and say, look at this model of political brilliance that we've devised. Rather than that, he said, take it into countries where they've just come out of a civil war or a country is just formed and say, here's how these guys made sense out of this mess that they were in at the time and how they worked together to actually get something passed that was better than the situation that they were currently in. Right, and this notion, you have a lot of the presidential candidates now referencing the Constitution as, this great infallible document that, I'm going to protect to the last breath of my life, right? And just, holding it up to be almost like some sort of religious document is just kind of crazy, right? Because when you it's like the old saying, right? You don't want to know. There are two things you don't want to know how they're made: laws and sausages, right? And you look into how the Constitution was actually put together, and you find, well, wait a minute, you're holding up to be this amazing thing. And I'm not saying the Constitution is not great, because it is. It's held up for a long time, right? And but it's not perfect. It's not something that we should say that this was completely well thought out from a philosophical perspective, and we solved all the problems of democratic governments. That's not it. Right? A lot of this stuff they didn't even expect to last, right? But it was just compromises that they had to make things better than they currently are. So anyway, it just makes you think twice about the notion of the sacrosanctness of all the articles of the Constitution. But anyway, interesting to look back on that and think about it with a little more of a critical eye. So this week, you guys are actually going to be looking at what the sausages, right? The laws that they actually came up with. I want you to read the rest of the Constitution this week, with the exception of the article that we read regarding the presidency, Article 2. So the rest of the articles, have a look at those this week. Also, I posted the paper topics. So if you have any questions about that, or you want to choose your own topic, just shoot me an email and we can talk about that. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'll post the discussion tomorrow, and hope you guys have a good week.